I was having a conversation with somebody about guns, and I remember saying that, they're really like valid reasons to have guns, especially if you live in areas where you don't have police nearby. I mean, this is something you learn in Texas, because especially when people live out in the country, you can't just go like to the corner and call 911. And there's a lot of valid reasons for gun culture. And she was just like, God, you are becoming a Republican. And to me, it always felt like it was the moment when I was introducing that their side wasn't as simple as they thought it was. And so it felt like a shutdown.
Welcome to the Unspeakable podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. This week's guest is a returning guest to the podcast, Sarah Hepola. I'll introduce her properly in a moment. But first, a couple items of business. The first is that as of next week, this podcast will be on summer hiatus. As you may know, I've got several projects I'm trying to juggle and or get off the ground, and I felt like it would be a good idea to give this podcast a breather. I promise it is not going anywhere, and it's possible I may drop in at some point with a solo episode if I find myself in a monologuing kind of mood. But as it stands, the show will be off for the rest of this month and August and be back around Labor Day. The good news for you, at least if you crave the sound of my voice, is that my new podcast with Sarah Hepola, A Special Place in Hell, is full steam ahead. If you have not checked it out yet, it's a podcast where Sarah and I talk about various cultural issues, many of them related to women, feminism, male-female dynamics, and the kinds of stuff you're not supposed to say about those things. Sarah, who has been on this show, by the way, and I have a 20-year age difference, so there's a lot of comparing and contrasting and not getting one another's pop culture references. This is a Substack podcast, but it is free and you can get it anywhere you get your usual podcasts, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, all of that. The main page for it is aspecialplace.substack.com, that you can always just type A Special Place in Hell into Google and find it. And God knows what else. If you do that, you can also find me on Twitter at Meghan_Daum. And I'll be linking to it a lot. By the way, the first episode of A Special Place in Hell, we discuss the confusing pronunciation of my last name. So if that's something that you've been wondering about, that's a great place for you to go. Okay, the other thing is that my project, The Unspeakeasy, is quickly gathering steam. This is a community for heterodox-minded women, or an intellectual community for free-thinking women. I'm trying maybe not to use the word heterodox so much because I think it confuses people. This will exist both online and in real person, in real life, in real person. Real people will be meeting in real life in the form of retreats, hopefully to exciting places. So if you are interested in that, go to theunspeakeasy.com. Okay. My guest, Sarah Hepola, you are probably familiar with. She was on the podcast back in March, and we got a little sidetracked from what we were originally going to talk about, so I brought her back. In this conversation, we discuss what's going on in media and journalism, what led her to write her Atlantic magazine article back in March called The Things I'm Afraid to Write. But we also spent a lot of time talking about abortion. We recorded this conversation exactly a week after Roe versus Wade was overturned. And we talk about the immediate effects of that in Texas, where Sarah lives. And she reflects on her own choices and complicated feelings about abortion. And we just generally talk about what feelings we have around this whole debate and what feelings we don't have. It's a great conversation. So here it is. Sarah Hepola, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Great to have you as always. So I've been wanting to have you back because when you were here a few months ago, the occasion was your Atlantic piece, the piece that came out in March called The Things I Was Afraid to Write About, The Things I Am
I'm
afraid
to write about.
Okay.
Present tense. Still.
That was present tense back then. Well, that's why you're back. I want to know what's changed. So yeah, we got a
My
lot of
hero's journey began there.
Yeah, that's right. All heroes' journeys begin in the Atlantic magazine, don't you know? So we got a little derailed in that conversation because we started talking about the Brock Turner sexual assault case, the Stanford swimmer case, and we really just sort of made many large meals out of that. So I wanted to have you back to sort of revisit some of the things that we maybe didn't get a chance to get to, visit them for the first time.
Yeah, I'm so proud to be a two-timer, by the way. It's got to be like a pretty small circle, but
yeah, I think Katie Herzog is a two-timer, Jamie Kilstein is a two-timer, and you are. So it's a trifecta. So we're recording this on Friday, July 1st. It's been a week to the day since Roe versus Wade was overturned. It feels like an eternity. Can you believe it's only been 7 days?
Yeah, no, it's so true. I've cycled through so many stages of grief. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah, and I want to hear from you about this because unlike most people I know, you live in Texas. You are from Texas. You live there now. What is it like in Texas right now?
Yeah, I do live in Texas. By the way, I live about a mile from where Roe v. Wade began because Norma McGorvey met Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington at an Italian restaurant about a mile from where I live in Dallas. So the roots of Roe v. Wade are right here where I live. And, you know, it's a case that I looked into, actually thought about doing a podcast about Roe v. Wade for a while. And so it's so weird. I don't know that I ever actually really thought it was going to be overturned. And I went through a period of disbelief. And of course, when you live in Texas, boy, there's a lot to recommend this place. But our politics on this topic are definitely not one of them. And there's a lot of uncertainty and fear. You know, I spent a fair bit of time yesterday talking to one of my pro-choice friends that works in reproductive health and one of my friends who is pro-life. Here in Texas, you tend to have a mix of those people. You know, I know people that are pro-life. I know people that are all over the map. One of the things that both of them expressed concern about was just that we're not set up for this. Like in terms of what it's going to do to women in Texas, there's already, we had a bill called SB 8, which put very strict limits on abortion. And already there was like an 800% rise in neighboring states and the demand for abortion. And one of the things that you saw was that there was such a long waiting list that women were having to wait even longer and longer. So if the point of the law was to make abortions earlier, it was doing quite the opposite, right? And so there's all this concern about that. And then there's a lot of concern around what it's going to mean in terms of trigger laws and how it's going to, like, there are doctors that are concerned about like ectopic pregnancies, or what if they're like, there is all these, there's going to be all these unforeseen consequences that we can really only guess what they're going to be, because a lot of the laws are written in ways that they could be shifted one way or the other. You know, it could be a horrible dystopia where everybody, you know, women are criminalized for losing their own pregnancies, or it could be where like, oh, it turns out that like a lot of people just get their pills online and it's not going to make that huge of a difference. But I do think whatever it does to the statistics on abortion, what it's done to, I think, a lot of young women, but also like medical providers, is to create an enormous amount of anxiety.
Yeah. So there was a piece in the New Yorker that came out just, I don't know, 48 hours or so after the news broke about an abortion clinic in Houston. It took place at, I guess, maybe it's the largest abortion clinic in Texas. It was a clinic in Houston. And, you know, the reporter was there, you know, even before the news broke. They were kind of, you know, all the people who worked there were looking at, you know, looking at the TV, waiting to see what was going to happen. The TV. They were probably looking at their phones. Let's get into 2022 here. And I was struck by a lot of things about the article, but one of them was just the number of women coming into the clinic who had no idea that this was even in peril. They didn't seem to be aware of the politics at all. Sometimes because they were immigrants or they were not native English speakers, but in other cases, they were like American women, ostensibly voting citizens that had absolutely no clue that this was going on.
That's fascinating. I mean, just doing something else, and not really paying attention to that. I think there's probably a lot of people like that, especially young people that might not be as politically active.
Right.
And a little bit checked out on that. And then what do you know? Guess what? The whole rules have changed.
I mean, it's funny because like the world that you and I are in it is obsessed with this issue. I mean, the world of women's media and the kind of feminist blogosphere, reproductive rights is main stage pretty much all the time. So it's really remarkable to think that somebody could not be aware that this was happening. Although, there was, I thought it was a well-reported piece. It's this one of those point and shoot kind of articles. It's not hard to write. You just kind of sit there and watch everything unfold and write it down. But at the end of the piece, there was a woman who was being turned away. She was a Spanish speaker, and she just seemed incredibly confused. And she says something like, well, if I can't get an abortion here, my friends tell me that there's a man from Mexico who will do it for me and I can go to him. And it was a really striking way to end a piece. Like as a journalist, as a writer, like that's okay. That's a good ending. However, there was no mention of the pills. There was no real acknowledgement that the landscape might have changed. There was still this kind of aura of catastrophe over the reporting. And we continue to see this in a lot of the news coverage, or at least I do. I don't know what you are noticing.
Yeah, I think there's a fair bit of that. Look, I think it's really hard for me to figure out whether I should be joining onto this catastrophizing, like doom and like, oh wow, it really is going to be bad. I think it is going to be a little bad for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're not sure exactly how that's going to look. But I tend to be someone who tries to look toward what this could build and what we could do differently. Roe v. Wade was such fraught legislation. We fought over it for the better part of 50 years. And I have, when I look at there's a Pew Research study that kind of laid out how everyone feels on abortion. And I spent some time with it recently and I found it very, very enlightening. There's 7 out of 10 people want abortion in most circumstances. And, the more you break this down, the more it's going to get, people are going to fall off the cracker, 6 weeks. Yes, most people are for it. 14 weeks, it's about half and half. By the time you get to 24 weeks, it's like not so many. And that's where Roe had drawn the line. I think we have an opportunity to build something that might be a more sustainable compromise. And I would really like to see that codified into law. And I really think there is so much support for this. And a few years of what I imagine are going to be very difficult will help rally people toward that goal, which I think is a really good place for us to be.
Yeah, that's exactly what Sarah Hepola said on the podcast I do with her, our new podcast, A Special Place in Hell. Yeah, there was going to be a period of real pain, and some women are going to suffer greatly. There are going to be babies born that are not wanted. There are going to be women that are harmed, probably die in a few cases. But at the end of the day, the pro-lifers are going to have to live with the consequences of their politics. It's one thing to stand on principle and another thing to live it on the ground.
And I guess I want to say as well, there's going to be people that are going to have children that they wouldn't have had in other settings, and then they will have a different kind of story, which is like, oh, wow, I almost had an abortion and now I have a child, which, I mean, sorry to be complicated, but I know this is the place.
Yes, please.
Like, look, I had an abortion when I was 30 years old. That's 17 years ago. And, my life kind of breaks off in these two directions. There's this life that was not lived. And a lot of that is relief. And there is also some grief mixed up in that. I've always found the way that we talk about our own personal abortions to be a little bit too simple. Like, it's not just relief and it's not just grief. It's some kind of twining of the two over the years, like pretty much everything in my life. But there will be other people that have different stories. And I don't mean to minimize that, but that will be a very interesting part of this as well.
Oh, wow. You're right. There will be more. I've never thought of that, actually.
Yeah, there will be children that will be born and people will say, I wanted to get an abortion, but I didn't. And now there's a child. Now, look, I have no idea what this is going to look like. There could be a lot of people that hate having children and will never say as much.
Sarah, nobody regrets having children, don't you know?
Yeah, I know. It's one of the biggest taboos.
Unheard of. No. So many people have said that to me. People like very smart in every single way, very well-meaning say, oh, Meghan, nobody regrets not having a child. That's just not possible. It's like, please, if you saw my inbox, my email, you would not say that.
Oh my gosh. I mean, look, I regret most things about my life and
Yeah.
at some point or the other, but look, I just think that there is I guess we're always living in a social experiment, if you want to be.
Yes.
But it really feels like we are right now. And, to speak to, when I spoke to my friend who is pro-life, one of the things that she was so angry about was that this law was changed without any of the structures in place to help these women that need the help. That is really distasteful. It is the way in which this issue becomes a political football. And, as has been pointed out many times, a lot of this political jockeying has more to do with winning a small war that will get you elected again than it has to do with helping women.
Yeah. And this is another thing I talked about with Sarah Hepola, just the idea that all these babies are going to be adopted happily ever after. That is a fantasy that I think a lot of people on the right have. And, frankly, a lot of people on the left. I mean, adoption is incredibly complicated. And I think those complications have been overlooked for a really, really long time. And that's starting to change. I mean, there's an adoptees' rights movement, for instance. But yeah, that's one thing that always kind of sticks in my craw, that that somehow this is going to be great because we have a supply chain problem with healthy infants in this country. And so this is going to somehow solve that. Yeah,
it all gets a little bit icky to talk about too,
Yeah, I mean, there's racial implications and there's all kinds. Yeah, I mean, this is a topic for another conversation. But, I just want to go back to this point that you made that's kind of blowing my mind, and it shouldn't be because it's obvious. So there are going to be women, men, there are going to be people who are parents who would not have been parents if they had been able to access abortion, and they are going to be forming opinions about abortion based on their experience. And sometimes their experience will be negative, and their opinions about abortion will remain extremely pro-choice. And there are experiences that are going to be extremely positive, and that might make them more pro-life.
Yeah, they'll have a very different story to tell, possibly. I mean,
we're creating
we can't even
a cohort that has not been there before, right? A cohort of people who assumed they thought one way, but now find themselves feeling a different way. And I wonder if the media will publish their stories.
Well, I'll tell you what, I can't wait to read their personal essays. You know how I am. I just want to read about people's experiences.
I don't know. Will they be published in The Atlantic? That's the question.
Yes. I think The Atlantic will still be around. I've been very impressed with how The Atlantic has skied the slopes of these last 5 to 10 years.
Yes, I was going to say threaded the needle, but yes, they have skied the slippery slopes,
The diamond slopes.
Yes, the double back diamond of the culture wars. I mean, you don't need to get into this too much if you don't want to, but this idea of a kind of pivotal moment in our lives, the before, there's the part of your, like the before time and the after time. And sometimes it can be like a teeny tiny little thing, like somebody saw a film that changed their lives. It can be something like that. Or it can be something like having an abortion. And, I'm curious if you feel like saying anything about how you imagine your life would have gone and how it's different than how you imagined it at the time. Do you now say, wow, I could have pulled this off and it would have actually worked in a way that was inconceivable to me at the time?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think as somebody that reads a lot of books and edited a lot of personal essays, I'm very familiar with the epiphany and the overused epiphany and the like, on this day, nothing was the same after that. Like you said, it could be, and genuinely, it could be a movie or something. But as a general rule, I think that stuff is pushed too hard. I don't think that's true in this case. 16 years ago, I had my boyfriend and I had broken up. We had breakup sex, and some genius was like, I'd run out of my pill. And I was like, why do I need to have a pill? I don't have a boyfriend.
That's a good way of, making sure you won't go back to him, right?
Yeah, exactly. A little bit of insurance.
Is it kind of like wearing really like ugly underwear when you go on a date?
Yeah.
So you
I was just like, finally, I don't have to worry about this anymore.
Right.
And then I went to go pack up my things, and we ended up having sex. And it was only a few days after my period, and I was sort of like, well, I haven't ovulated yet, like my genius reproductive. Anyway, but I ended up getting pregnant. When I went into Planned Parenthood, the woman I was like, but I hadn't ovulated yet, and she was like, no, that's not how the pill works. It actually suppresses ovulation, so as soon as you stop, that's when you release an egg.
Oh, really?
And I was like, oh, so the time that I thought that I couldn't have a kid, she was like, right, you were the most fertile. Damn it. So I was 30 years old, which struck me as rather late for this story. And I had, because we'd broken up, I'd announced I was going to move to New York. I was going to go off and make my way in the world. This was going to change it quite dramatically. I thought that we would maybe get together. And we ended up, he was very clear with me. If you have this child, I'll support you if I can, but we're not getting back together. I'll support you in any way I can. In other words, it's your decision and I'll help you, but girl, we're not a couple anymore. And I just wanted, see, this is where you and I are a little bit different, because I'd always wanted a child, always wanted a kid. And the idea that I was going to do it and I wasn't going to do it right. And this pains me a little bit, because, I'll hear people dog on my cohort of, single liberal women, just like, oh, you want everything to be perfect. You want to wait for the perfect moment. Well, no, I didn't want to wait for a perfect moment, but I didn't want to be underwater. And it was so important to me that my thought then, I think my biggest fear when that happened was that I wouldn't get a chance to have a child. That would be my only chance. Now, that was me living in my own social experiment. You really can't know how that's going to turn out till you roll the clock forward. I'm now 47 years old. It turns out that I never did get pregnant again. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. I could have gone down the IVF route and the fertility route and all those things. I chose not to. I could have had a child on my own, but like I wanted these things to line up and they didn't. And it had a profound effect on my life. For instance, I moved to New York. I don't think that my writing career would be nearly what it is right now. But I don't know what that other thing would have been. There's a phrase called ambiguous loss that I learned in reading a book by Ada Calhoun called Why We're Not Sleeping. And it was applying to women that, didn't have kids. And you don't really know what it is that you lost. It could be great. It could be terrible. It could have been wonderful. It could have been just the same. I mean, now this is sort of like Sarah's Black Mirror episode where like two lives, or sliding doors episode.
Sliding
right,
doors.
is better, where like two lives exist and I can never really tell you which one would have been better. And I could torture myself over that. I think on balance, I'm happy with where my life came out. I will tell you, I do have grief over that. That doesn't mean I regret it. But it does mean that I don't think it's for me, it was not an uncomplicated procedure.
So the ex-boyfriend who said, "I will help you in any way I can," what did that look like to you at the time? And would he have been required to help you? Like, this is something that I think also people don't talk about enough. Like, what is legally required? I mean, not that you know. What would legally have been required of him? How far would you have gone, conceivably, hypothetically, to make sure that he did support you?
I think it was such a gut hit that he wasn't going to get back together with me and raise this. Like, I had this sense that like we should be together. And for him to say no was such a gut hit. My mind was really stuck in this place of like, he had started seeing somebody else and we both hung out at the bar all the time. I'm a former lousy drunk and, quit drinking about 12 years ago. But at the time I was drinking quite a bit. In fact, as we were having this discussion, he was drinking scotch and I was drinking, Diet Coke or whatever. And the moment that I decided to have an abortion, I said, get me a scotch. That was my signal. Like, I'm staying on this train and I'm not getting off. But what I remember flashing forward to in my mind was, I'm going to be living with my parents. He's going to be out at the bar. Like, he can say, I will do everything I can to support you. I don't believe him. I don't know what he would have been legally responsible for. He's a good dude, but I just was like, no effing way. Even if he did pony up some money or whatever the legal limits were, he's going to be out having fun. I'm going to be changing diapers with my mom and dad. It was really interesting. I have put some thought into, well, would I have made a different decision if I'd had more support? In other words, like, I just had the sense of like, I don't want to be a single mom. Like, I can't afford it. I have to move in with my parents.
Did they know? Did your parents know?
No, I never told them. I told them many years later. And this is something that I'm writing about in my book. I have a second memoir that I'm working on, which is about, being somebody that wanted to get married and wanted to have kids, but ended up having neither. And sort of like, how did that happen? So I told my parents, my dad was the hardest one. It was very, my dad, men want to fix things, like that's like, I know that's it's like a knock on them, but like, it's also like a dear thing about them. And this was like, I was probably like 45 years old. And I told him, and he was like, I could have taken early retirement. And I was like, oh, Daddy, no, he's trying to fix it now. It's like
15 years later.
15 years later, he's going to take early retirement in the past to help me with my kids. I have to say that was, it was tough to see that. It was tough for my parents. But at the time, I didn't want them to know about it. I really had a sense that like, I don't need to tell anybody. And in fact, I'm a confessionalist by trade. And I never told people about this for many, many years. Even as drunk as I was, I really just wouldn't even go into it. To the point where it was probably, I was in my late 30s and I was talking to somebody and I actually would forget that I had an abortion.
Why do you think that is? Because certainly there is a thread in the zeitgeist that's all about the shout your abortion kind of.
This was a little bit prior to that.
Before that,
This was a little bit prior to that. And I was working at Salon and I was editing a lot of stories about abortion because that was really my lane. I was basically a lifestyle editor there and sort of working in the lane of feminism and women's lives. And I would edit a story about abortion and then I would like get up and feel dizzy. And I the best my understanding is like, I just compartmentalized this. And I'm not a particularly good compartmentalizer. This is not at all my superpower. My superpower is probably integration and living a little bit, closer to the skin. And so this thing that I just kind of tucked away because it wasn't particularly convenient for me to think about. And it really became much more of a real deal to me as I I inched into my late 30s and I was realizing with almost like a little bit of a pain, like, oh my God, I didn't have a kid. I was 40 years old when I put out my first book. And it was in the years after that this thing exploded inside me of like, oh my God, I think I only have a couple more years, which by the way, it's a little bit darling that somebody in their early 40s is like, oh, I only have a couple more years. Because fertility doctors were like, are you sure? And I was like, yeah, time's, moving on. And they were like, I think you might be past it. But anyway, these were all things I dealt with in my early 40s for whatever reason. And, it's a strange thing.
I would also imagine, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, that, especially with all you've written about getting sober, I'm sure you've wondered if you would have gotten sober at the time of having that baby, if that would have been the catalyst.
I do. I had a little bit of a like, oh, I could have stopped drinking because, even then, so I was 30 years old and I eventually quit at 35. But by the age of 30, I really had this awareness that like I drank too much, that like there was this sense that I was living on kind of like cheap gas in the way, like that my life was sort of like too much hedonism, too much indulgence. There wasn't enough kind of like central purpose. And I've been told that this is like a terrible reason to have a kid, but I also think it's like probably a really great reason to have a kid, which is that there's something other than you at the center of your life. And it struck me as something that I very much needed. Now, since then, so I do think I would have sobered up for a little while. Since then, I have suspected that I would have started drinking around the time that like somebody blew the whistle, And I've had too many friends that were very heavy drinkers, especially in early motherhood, because you're home a lot, that you're bored, you're looking for some sort of companionship.
Well, and there's the whole mommy needs a drink culture.
Hell yeah.
The wine mom world.
I think I would have become like number one wine mom.
Yeah.
Look at me with my baby at the bar, like, hey, drinking for two. And who knows what that life would have been like. I have so many friends that had really bad drinking problems after they had children.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I know what you mean about the sort of guardrails on a life. I mean, it's something I think about. I, do not regret not having kids at all, as you know, and as I've talked about a lot. But nonetheless, I do sometimes find myself thinking about how, I'm not sure nice is the word, but how maybe there might be an element of relief if there was something that was just sort of forcing me to go one way or the other. Like I've been in a very unsettled place for the last several years. I've kind of like, when I got divorced 5 years ago and then I moved back to New York from Los Angeles where I'd been a long time. And I kind of was like, well, I'm only here for a few years. And, I had like, didn't have, I like lived in a small apartment and I've had one foot out the door of my life for the last almost 6 years now. And it's not a good way to live. It's really, I think it takes a toll that you don't even really realize. You don't realize it's happening. You're like, well, it's okay. It's temporary. And this is my choice and I'm deciding to be this way. And if I figure out this work project or get this thing out of the way, then I'll make a move in one direction. And, I've sometimes thought, wow, like if I had a kid, that would, not be the right thing for me. However, it would force me to say, okay, you're going to live here and you're going to live, this is the school that your kid is going to go to. And this is going to be his or her bedroom. And this is the house. And too bad if it's not like your dream domicile. And this is what it is. And I get the appeal of that, actually.
I do too. Our, what do I want to call her? I was going to say predecessor. Anyway, Elizabeth Wurtzel is who I'm going to right now.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
People,
if you don't know who she is, she's the author of Prozac Nation. That was her big breakout. She's one of those 90s gals.
Yeah, she really paved the way in terms of first-person writing for women, I think. And I have mixed feelings on her, as I suspect you do too, but she can be a hell of a writer sometimes. Anyway, I read something she wrote that stayed with me, and it was about being single and childless in her 40s. And she said something to the extent that, if you end up not having kids, you end up by your 40s in constant existential crisis because of the sort of constant focus on self. Now, I think you and I are also in an existential crisis because of what's happened in our industry and in the world.
Good segue, Sarah.
Thank you.
I don't think I'm in existential crisis, actually. Because I'm so lucky that my work fulfills me. It definitely frustrates me, and I've definitely had to make a pivot, and it's definitely been a super challenging time. But at the end of the day, I feel that I know why I am on this earth. Okay. And that is an incredible privilege. Like, just that is a great luck to have that feeling about your life.
I feel like I've gotten to live a life that women of previous generations, it would have been unthinkable. A life of travel and art and personal exploration. I mean, just like the freedom that I've had.
We would have been nuns. I would have been a nun. I think if I lived 150 years ago, I think I could have romanticized my way to life in a convent or something.
You would have been the coolest nun. I think I would have been a total full on mom, and part of me might have loved it, and then had this aching unfulfilled part of me that I never could express. But the thing is that I never want to lose sight of how much this has given me. And then, of course, there have been sacrifices, and I can never fully weigh them.
Yeah. But that's the thinking about yourself all the time. I mean, one thing I will say, I think in marriages where there are not children, and I'm not actually talking about anyone in particular, but, having just sort of observing marriages around me, if you don't have kids, your marriage is right in front of your face all the time. Your relationship, whatever, whether or not you're married.
Right?
Yeah. It's in front of your face. And so you're just picking it apart all of the time. And children are a real distraction from that. I mean, they're a distraction from a bad marriage.
And they're a glue in many ways,
yes,
That's such a good point.
Yeah. I mean, none of these are reasons to have kids, obviously. But yeah, I think that's interesting that Lizzie Wurtzel, God rest her soul.
The late Lizzie
Wurtzel. Yeah, it was so funny when she died. Was it a few years ago now? For some reason, I mean, I barely knew her. I maybe met her one or two times, and I kept getting media calls to, give a quote about her. I think I was quoted in the New York Times obituary for some reason.
See, I can totally see that. I think that's why I was looking for whatever word I was looking for, where I was prototype or progenitor or whatever the hell I was going with
we're
that.
her protege. Yeah, something like that.
I do think of you in particular as somebody who is in that lane.
But she was a hot mess. It was, I mean, we were not the same personality type.
No, you're not the same personality type, but you were young and you were brash and you were blonde and you were attractive and you were writing about
obsessed with dogs. She was obsessed with her dog too, so that we have that in common too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, by the way, in the memoir genre, hot mess is going to be, I mean, that's kind of one out of every three of us, half of us.
Yeah. Well, you have to be a hot mess on the page. I mean, that's the thing, is when you're writing first person, that you have to sort of, there has to be a layer of drama onto the narrative that you hopefully don't have in your real life. I think the persona on the page is a exaggerated version.
Yes, and I think you're making the point that she was in fact a hot mess in real life.
She was actually
a really bad hot mess. She worked at the Dallas Morning News here, and people still tell stories about that. I think year or summer that she worked there. And you are somebody that has a lot more sort of control and grace.
I didn't have I didn't have quite the the cocaine-addled party girl aspect to me.
Right.
Right. I was a mess in many ways, many ways. But yeah.
Young, brash, and blonde, though. I'm still going to write a trend story about the two of you.
Okay, go for it. I was going to say, please, you can wait, wait till I die, but hopefully it won't be that. Hopefully that will not be the occasion for the piece. I have a friend who used to say, so there was this sort of like trope of women, there would be like a sort of famous author and then her best friend who was also a writer but not as famous, and the like Lucy Greeley and
I was going to say Ann Patchett. Yeah, Ann Patchett and Lucy Greeley.
Right. And then there was like Caroline Knapp and somebody else.
Oh, and the other person, I can't remember whose book I read, but it was nice.
Right, exactly. And so my friend Allison used to say that she was gonna wait for me to die, and then she was gonna write a book called Dead Meghan, and that was gonna be her breakout. That was gonna be her debut onto the literary stage.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And actually I did get, I had a freak illness about 10 years ago, and I almost did die. And she came to the hospital.
She lost her book deal.
And she said, damn, I almost had Dead Meghan. Yes.
Can you think about somebody else for once, Meghan?
I know. Sorry.
Yeah. We're glad you're still here.
So let's talk about our dead industry, our dead media industry. What happened? So you and I were recently tarred as neocons by somebody on Twitter. And the context was like, wow, it's really sad what's happened to Meghan Daum and Sarah Hepola, that they became neocons. I used to really look up to them and enjoy their work.
It was amazing to me because it was the first time anybody had called me a neocon, to my knowledge. And I found myself, at first I laughed, but then as the day went on, I was really obsessed with like, what created this idea in this person's mind? What did I write? I actually had this thought of like, did I tag a neocon? Was I seen with a neocon recently? Oh, yeah. What is my adjacency? And in fact, I went to Wikipedia's neocon page to read about neocons. Oh,
really?
To see if it had a sort of concept creep that I wasn't aware of. Because I was like, okay, I think when I think of neocons, I think of like George W. Bush. And
a neocon, by the way, for people who aren't familiar, a neocon is a neoconservative, and we associate this with like, the kind of the conservative movement as it was manifesting in like the early 90s kind of thing, right? Like sort of, there's also neoliberals. There's neoliberals, by the way. I think I'm a neoliberal still.
I'm more neo-soul. I don't know. That's Erica Badu. I don't know where. I don't know what my category is, but I'll tell you what, if I was firmly in the pocket of liberal dogma at any time in my life, it was during the Bush years.
Well, exactly. I thought George W. Bush was the worst person on earth. And when he was reelected, I honestly thought that was the worst thing that had ever happened in the history of America.
I know. Talk about like the future teaching you that you were a little bit exaggerated in the past.
Walk across glass to have him back as president. During the Trump administration.
I did go to the George W. Bush Museum. I actually, again, I'm too preoccupied with why I was called a neocon, but I was like, I did go to the Bush Museum. It's here in Dallas.
Oh, well, maybe that's why. Maybe the person saw you there.
Yeah, maybe they saw me there. Maybe I put it on social media and I can't remember. Anyway, yeah, I do. I have this sort of like, I have this like regret and nostalgia for Bush. And anyway, the idea... I have been over the past, I would say 5 years is where it's happened, that people have said, wow, you're so much more conservative than I thought you were. Or wow, you're really like a Republican. What are you, some kind of Republican? It's very interesting. It's very telling of this moment that people use that as a tar. The way to shut you down, especially the way to shut me down, is to basically say, you're sounding a lot like a Republican. And this was something...
Over what? Like, for instance?
Okay, well, one of those was about... I was having a conversation with somebody about guns, and I remember saying that, they're really that's like valid reasons to have guns, especially if you live in areas where you don't have police nearby. I mean, this is something you learn in Texas, because especially when people live out in the country, you can't just go like to the corner and call 911. And there's a lot of valid reasons for gun culture. And she was just like, God, you are becoming a Republican. And to me, it always felt like it was the moment when I was introducing that their side wasn't as simple as they thought it was. And so it felt like a shutdown. The one that, I mean, where I really ran afoul of liberal dogma was around the fact that I got sober 12 years ago. And in 2015, I put out a book called Blackout, which had a lot of stories and reflection on my own life, on my years as a heavy drinker. There was a lot of talk in there around sex and its blurry areas when you get into the drinking culture, which is what I came out of and what I knew at the time most cultures were still steeped in. And there was this incredible resistance to talk about drinking and its role in these sexual assault statistics that we were seeing. You know, early on in researching my book, I interviewed a blackout expert. I don't want to name him because I don't think he would ever avow this phrase now, but he was speaking sort of pre-Me Too. And he said, look, if we got rid of alcohol on these campuses, 98% of these cases would go away. And that became something that was, no, alcohol has nothing to do with it. We're looking at predatory behavior. This is like, these are serial predators. This is rape culture. It was a very different lens on which they wanted to look through what I understood to be some, in many ways, like really awful outgrowths of hookup culture and binge drinking on college campuses. And that was something that, what am I, some kind of rape apologist? Which that was a phrase, the first time I heard it, it shut me down so hard because I was just like, well, no. And then later I was like, well, what does that even mean?
Yeah, it's one of those grab you by the collar.
It grabbed me by the collar.
That really is meaningless at this point.
Somebody should apologize for rape.
Well, somebody should apologize for calling so many people rape apologists. Start God.
There. And so I went through a few years of feeling like the other one, here's another one that got called a Republican. You ready for a phrase? Personal responsibility.
Oh, that's
a dog
violence.
Whistle.
That's literal violence, Sarah. I'm gonna have to bleep that out of the podcast. Personal responsibility, that is patriarchal, that is white supremacy, that is what else? It's just you're policing women's lives.
Yeah, and it was something that I didn't quite understand. I went into AA in 2011, and that was a program of personal responsibility. It was really about a kind of personal reckoning of what you've done in your life and who do you need how can you see eye to eye with the world again? How can you be somebody that feels proud of who you were and where you came from? What are the amends you need to do? What are the changes in your life you need to make? Well, anyway, that was such the business for me of like 2012, 2013, 2014. And at the same time, I'm starting to see these articles come out that are sort of like, this is not about the woman. This is not on women. And I was like, but if it's not on women, then women can change.
Well, I mean, it's this utopian vision. I mean, yes, it would be great to live in a world where people could get blackout drunk and nothing would ever happen to them. Anybody, men or women. It would be great to live in a world where a woman could pass out on the sidewalk in the middle of a big city and somebody would very nicely call her friend and have her get home safely. But that's never going to happen. I mean,
no,
let's work with what we have.
I have to say, as somebody that had come out of my own very serious drinking problem, I really didn't understand quite the desire to fight for our blackouts in the way that conversation was doing. There was I want to get as blackout drunk as I want to. And like, do you realize there's other consequences to that? Like, it's actually not very healthy. There's a lot of, it's blackout BAC in some cases is not that far from where you the body starts to shut down because the brain is starting to shut down. Anyway, I hate to be a buzzkill. I'm not, I never wanted to take, I'm not, not a prohibitionist, really don't want to take people's booze away, really will always love my drinkers out there. I was one of you for a long time. That's not what this is about. But to me, it didn't seem like it was a realistic way to look at the world and its consequences. And that if you want to arm young women to walk through the world with more confidence and also safer, then you would focus on that. And it just seemed like there was like a prohibition. I started to feel the fundamentalist zap that I had felt from my childhood. I grew up in Dallas, in a pretty conservative part of the city in the 80s. And fundamentalism was all around me. And there was a lot of like, you can't say that, you can't do that, you can't, like there was a lot of do not cross tape. And one of the reasons that I was drawn towards liberalism and the liberal Valhalla of Austin in the 90s, where I finally felt like I found my spiritual home, was this idea of life as you could be intellectually curious, you could be expansive, you could listen to dangerous art. Like all of this was so like, that's what sort of fed my soul and formed my personality. And all of a sudden I was starting to see the zaps coming from the left. You can't say that. You're not allowed to do that. Like, don't talk about that. Don't mention that. And it's like, wait a minute, what? Don't listen to those people. You know, I mean, you get into a place where like, I love listening to fascinating, deep, challenging thinkers. And I got to a place where it was like, I didn't want people to know I was listening to Joe Rogan in the same way that like, when I was a kid, I didn't want people to know I was listening to heavy metal. It's like, well, that's the devil's music. Like, what if people find out that I'm listening to the devil's music of Joe Rogan?
It's amazing. A lot of people maybe under 30, say, have absolutely no idea that it was once the Republicans. It was the political right that was the purity police. It was completely flipped around. I mean, I've had conversations with students, like grad students, and they don't know this. They think that the people on the right have always been sort of hedonistic and just slinging their guns around and and sort of say whatever you want and say whatever you want. Say shooting. That it's really the people on the right who are shooting their mouths off. Say what they don't want you to say. Say what everybody's thinking but are afraid to say. They associate that with the right.
Oh my God, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and they don't have any idea that the whole church lady sketch that wasn't that long ago, but it was a completely different ethos.
That is so interesting because, of course, like hedonistic culture and the counterculture, like that's basically where so much of that comes from, is from the growth of like liberalism throughout the 60s and 70s and through the 80s and 90s. It was always associated with a much more libertine culture, a much more accepting culture, especially around things like sexuality, which at the time was very taboo.
Yeah, I mean, the left won the culture wars.
The left won the culture war.
Is like, the right controls the political, in many ways, the far right has sort of political chokehold on our country, legislatively. Not always, obviously, depends on the states. But at the end of the day, I mean, do you think that culture sort of supersedes politics? I mean, culture affects our day-to-day lives in a way that, at least until last week, politics really didn't.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like this overturning of Roe v. Wade is a real smack in the face to the idea that like culture rules the day, right? Like you can have all the celebrities you want on your team and you can have a bunch of movies in Hollywood talk about woke politics, but is that going to change life on the ground of what it is to be a young woman and what you can do with your body? I mean, this is for decades, I just thought, like, who would even be a Republican? Like, why would you ever do it? Because everything I turned to, my music, my movies, my books, everybody was liberal. It just felt like that was the side.
Oh, yeah. It was no fun to be a Republican. It was definitely not the fun party.
It was not the fun party at all. But now, I mean, I feel like the dance has changed. And I don't know, Democrat is so fun.
We're going to pause here for a short message from me. Are you appreciating this conversation and wishing there were more like it out there? Well, there are lots more right here. I do this show every week, and I pretty much do it all by myself. That is why, as much as I'm loath to ask for help, people who know me know this, I am offering this gentle reminder that if you value honest, thoughtful, nuanced conversations with all kinds of people, novelists, scientists, philosophers, comedians, journalists, sometimes even just regular folks with something interesting to say, I hope you'll consider supporting the show in any way you can. One way to do this is by joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/theunspeakable. You can join for as little as $5 a month. That gives you early and ad-free access to the show, or for as much as $100 a month. And yes, people have done that. There are lots of perks at every level, including if you join at the $10 a month tier or higher, the chance to join our bi-weekly hangout, where we, and that includes me, get together on Zoom to talk about a recent specific episode of the show. Joining at that level also gets you discounts on your first purchase of official Unspeakable Podcast Nuanced AF merchandise. If Patreon is not your thing, you can also make a one-time donation in any amount by going to the podcast's webpage at theunspeakablepodcast.com and clicking the donation button. This podcast is a one-woman enterprise. I'm not affiliated with any institution, media company, secret investment cabal, or anything like that. I do it because I love it. And if you love it, or even like it, I hope you'll consider supporting it in any way that makes sense for you. Leaving a positive rating or review wherever you get your podcasts is a big help, actually. And telling people about the podcast, sharing it with friends, just spreading the word actually means more to me than anything. So thank you for listening to the show, for making the unspeakable worth speaking. And with that, back to the interview. Well, I want to delve a little bit more into how we became neocons. But actually, before I forget, I want to circle back to something along the lines of, women drinking too much. A lot of these, the idea that men are always responsible. How do you feel about the whole your skirt was too short kind of logic? Because this is something I really struggle with, because obviously wearing a short skirt is not licensed for a man to do anything to you, whistle at you, say something obscene to you, let alone assault you. However, I don't know. I kind of feel like if you don't want men to look at you in a certain way on the street or talk to you a certain way, you shouldn't dress like that. Now, what do we do with what I just said?
You're such a Republican.
Well, yes, I suppose so.
I'm just teasing you, neocon.
I'm not even a mother, and I'm saying that, okay?
So I think this is fascinating, and I've thought a lot about it. One of the things that I think is that through the kind of pop sexualization of women, one of the things that happened was that fashions became so popular that were denuded of their sexual power for a lot of women. In other words, I've met so many young women that were wearing things like mini skirts or little like halter tops, not because they wanted to be sexy, but because they were fashionable and they saw their other friends wearing them, and they didn't have a full sense of the valence of what they were doing. I think I don't know if you know any young teenagers are really interesting to study here on this one. As young women are coming into their bodies and they're starting to put on like a bikini, and like if it's a kid that's just hit puberty and you're just kind of like, as the older person, you're like, whoa, this has totally changed. Like your body just has tractor beams now. And this is something that I think for a lot of women, they don't always have a sense of their own erotic power. What they are saying is a kind of sexual signaling. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't do it or they shouldn't wear it, but it's something that in America, we've been a little bit numbed to, where like if you travel in the Middle East and you show your arms, like you're there like, what are you doing? On certain parts of the Middle East, not all of them. So, I think that we've become kind of desensitized to that. And I sympathize with both parties on this one. I sympathize with the woman that's like, hey, I'm wearing a short skirt. That's not permission. And I also sympathize with the guy that's like, hey, she's wearing a short skirt. That's an open for business sign. And I've heard that from both sides. And how are you going to resolve this? And who has the burden of resolving it? One idea is that you could, I guess, think more about what kind of image you want to portray, or et cetera, et cetera. Or you could expect other people to change their minds. I don't think asking people to change their minds is usually a good way, is like a good tack. In AA, there's a saying, which is you can wear slippers or you can carpet the world. And I remember telling this to a friend of mine who disagrees on a lot of these issues with me. We would have a lot of arguments about this. And I was bringing up the case of, like you can change your behavior or you can try to change the world's behavior. You can try to carpet the world. And she looked at me and she was like, you know what? I'm going to carpet the world. And I was
Wait a second. Which is bad? Sorry, I'm like trying to follow this.
Oh,
go ahead. Which are you supposed to do? Wear the slippers or carpet the world?
Well, which one would be easier?
Well, I hate carpet. This is a really bad analogy for me because as anybody who knows my work knows, I cannot, anything with carpet is just anathema. But okay, but
most people would say it would be easier to wear slippers than to try to carpet the world.
But is it like carpeting the world sort of not, is that like not having a boundary, or is it like trying to change the world?
It's
like
trying to change the world in a way that might be unrealistic.
So like what we're asking people to change their behaviors to sort of satisfy our own neuroses or needs or just
your own needs. Yeah, I wouldn't even say neuroses, but like you can change yourself or you can try to change everyone else.
Okay.
And my friend was saying, okay, yeah, I'm going to try to change everyone else. And I was like,
really?
Good luck to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly norms can be changed. I mean, plenty of behaviors have been sort of socially engineered out of the culture. People don't smoke the way they used to.
Do they not?
Well, okay. You know what's here's a better example. People don't litter the way they once did, right?
Yeah, it's true. And people don't smoke. I just happen to smoke.
Yeah, no, I know. But I mean, you can't smoke indoors the way
you can't smoke indoors. No, they crack down on us.
It's a hell of a lot harder. Yeah, it's a hell of a lot harder to smoke than it used to be. Believe me, because I used to do it and quite enjoyed it. But something like littering, it's completely taboo now to like throw something. Throw trash on the ground. So, it is possible to change behaviors, but, things like the way that certain kinds of men relate to women on the street, that is something that the feminist blogosphere, especially, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, was really interested in. I'm not going to say preoccupied with, but definitely interested in. There was the cat calling, there was a lot of talk about male behavior on the streets. There was a lot of talk about women being harassed when they walk down the street. And I had, I've had students, young female students, write personal essays about how they feel about being catcalled. And, it's never discussed. The fact is that the men that are doing that have, generally speaking, so much less power than the women they're doing that to, especially the kinds of women. Yeah.
I think it's actually like a kind of domination in terms of like, it's one way that I can get up on you, rich white girl.
And they're signaling to their friends. I mean, the guys who are standing around on the corner catcalling women, as a friend of mine said, he said, those guys never get laid. Like those are the lowest guys on the totem pole. And they are basically what they're saying to their buddy every time they do that is, I'm not gay.
Exactly.
That's what they're doing. And so for like a white middle class young woman going to work in the morning and being whistled at by guys on the street, construction workers, whatever, for her to complain about that, it's so unexamined. And it always really bothered me. And also the fact is that, Black women, for instance, get way worse catcalling than white women. I mean, those guys on the corner are doing it to women of color, I think, a hell of a lot more intensely than to a lot of white women. At least this is what I've observed in New York. Obviously, it really depends on where you are. But nobody ever looks at this.
I've only ever been catcalled in New York. I've never had this experience in other places. I mean, maybe like some construction workers have like sort of stopped and watched me or something, but like I've only ever been catcalled in New York.
Oh, that's funny. It's so weird because like maybe in the last 10 years, I remember thinking, I guess it was when I moved back to New York because I had been living in LA where nobody walks down the street. So you don't really get catcalled. But when I moved back to New York, when I was in my sort of like my mid 40s, I was like, wow, I guess like, the political correctness has really like taken hold here or something because the guys just don't catcall anymore. I guess they've really gotten the message. Like, I guess feminism really, had its way. And then it's like, no, Meghan, it's because you are 46 years old. That's why you're not being catcalled. That was not the first thing that came to my mind. So, yeah.
Though this reminds me, though, of some of the conversations that you and I would have privately over these years. I was always struck by the wealth of stories about women's lack of safety, that women were unsafe and they were scared. And they were scared in the world, and it was so scary and it was really baffling to me because I couldn't figure out, was I an idiot? Did I miss something? Because, like when I was 25 years old, I drove around the country by myself. I slept in national parks by myself. There were people that told me it was dangerous, and I didn't think it was. I thought I was well prepared, and I mean, I did some stupid stuff, but
how are you well prepared? I might be scared to sleep in a national park by myself, but because of bears.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that I was doing car camping. And so you're like, when you're car camping,
you're sleeping in your car.
You're
right.
Not in your car, but you have your tent right next to your car.
Okay.
And
right.
so there's people within walking distance. A lot of the national parks were very family oriented.
Okay.
So it would be a lot of like, there were couples around me and I would know them. I mean, I did have some creepy interactions. Mostly they were anyway.
Okay, I get it.
I was out for 5 months.
You're not doing like a Chris McCandless thing, like sleeping out in the middle of Alaska.
And it wasn't a Cheryl Strayed's Wild, like hiking across the Pacific Crest Trail.
Yeah, you'd have an entirely different career. I wouldn't be able to book you if it was a Cheryl Strayed scenario. So.
Exactly. But it was quite an adventure, and it was one that I took alone, and. There were a lot of people that were uncomfortable with it, and I just never had that sense. I never had that sense that I couldn't do that. And it worried me that there was an increasing sense that women were vulnerable. Women were like, I understand wanting to create the awareness of that, but if you give that message too much, it can shrink your world instead of expand it. You start not doing things.
Yeah. I mean, especially, it's funny because it so depends on what you're used to. Because people in the city, become terrified when they go out into the country. People from the city are terrified of serial killers, like when they go out into the country.
They are convinced that the country is like 90% serial killers.
Yeah. So, but then people in the country who are from rural areas are convinced that everybody in the city is, a murderer. Someone's going to stab you in an alley. So, but yeah, I do. Certainly, I know a number of women who have been violently attacked. I mean, I certainly know women who have had things happen, like somebody breaks through the window and rapes them, and like stranger rape, like horrific kinds of crimes. So that definitely does happen. But yeah, like this idea that every time you walk out of your home and are out in the world, that somehow you're fighting this insurmountable battle, that is the kind of rhetoric that I started noticing around 2014, 2015, which, getting back to the whole premise of this conversation, is I think when people like you and me started to feel out of step with the narrative, like that's when I started saying like, whoa, wait a second. All of you guys who, were pretty much feeling like you were on top of the world as women for the last 15, 20 years, suddenly you're like really into this idea that it's incredibly hard to be you. And I still don't know where that came from.
Yeah, I don't either. I felt destabilized by it. I felt a lot of like, is it me? Am I the only one? Am I? And so this is, leading up to why I wrote that piece for The Atlantic, was that there were several years of me watching various stories explode. I think also like the pile on around certain artists that we'd once loved. I mean, the Woody Allen situation, like all these things, people that it seemed, all these stories seemed so much more complicated than what I was seeing. But to bring up the complication was to get the fundamentalist zap again, like how could you be on that side? How dare you? And, so I was starting to retreat from stories. I was staying in lanes, like I was writing for a magazine here called Texas Highways. I mean, it was just sort of more like travel pieces. I was trying to stay in safe harbors. I was trying to stay away from this culture war stuff. And believe me, it took about 4 years before I could finally had to say, like, I don't think you can avoid the culture wars anymore.
Mm-hmm. So what made you finally decide to write the piece?
I mean, I think it was a sense that I was either going to stop my career as a writer, or I was going to start a different kind of writing. And I didn't know what I'd do. I've thought about quitting writing so many times over the years. The problem is I could never figure out what the hell else I would do.
Yeah, I have the same problem.
Yeah. I'm worthless, basically. In others, like my skill sets are very
Yeah, I know. Talk about regret. If I could go back, the biggest regret I have is not like getting really good at something else and also writing. Like that was my mistake. I just kind of went for broke and quite literally succeeded.
But I know we did. We both went for broke. Ta-da! I was also about 10 years into sobriety, and I realized that one of the problems I had was that, like a lot of my drinking had been around people pleasing, and a lot of my early sobriety was around trying to keep this idea that like people still like me, right? Everybody still likes me. I really, I needed to let go of this need to be liked that was keeping me back. Because if I needed to be liked by everyone, I was finding that I was not liking myself so much, wasn't really respecting what I was doing. So I needed to break out of that. And I also think that, look, are we in this or not? Like if you're a writer, this time is fascinating.
Oh, I know.
This time is fascinating. I remember like when I was a little kid, not a kid, I was in high school. My English teacher had a line on the wall from William Faulkner, and it said, "The only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself." And I loved that. It made total sense to me. And, if you want to look at like the human heart in conflict with itself, it's like, go anywhere these days. Like that is what the world is. And there is like, by talking about it, you run the risk of being unpopular. You run the risk of falling afoul of people that that think you're on the wrong side of history or think you're wrong. But I allow that it's like, it's a brave act to work out this stuff in public, as I think that you've done. I think podcasts like this, podcasts like The Fifth Column have given me courage that I wasn't alone in my thinking. We've become so isolated sometimes. And as I'm somebody that I don't have a husband, I don't have a school that I'm going to, talking to other moms or whatever people's social circles are. And so you start to get in your own head, like, I guess I'm just old. I don't really. And then, you start to be connected to people either through someone else's words on a podcast, or maybe through their communities or online communities or whatever it is. And you start to realize, like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. Everybody's just shutting the hell up.
Yeah, I know. And that in and of itself is the story of our time, I think. The very phenomena that you just described, that is the essence of the heart being in conflict with itself. The fact that you can't talk about the heart being in conflict with itself is like the best show in town when it comes to subject matter.
It really is. It really is. And, the way that people project certainty on topics that are like completely uncertain, the way that they project a certain kind of politics, whether it's around feminism or equality or whatever it is, and have a life that looks very different. All that stuff is really fascinating to me, but it's like we can't quite get to it because there's this force field of outrage and scorn. And for me, for a long time, that force field was enough to shut me down. I just didn't want to make contact with it. So maybe if I stay very still, the tornado will not touch me.
So you must have people writing to you and coming up to you all the time now and thanking you. I mean, what kinds of reactions are you getting?
Yeah, I mean, I think after the Atlantic article especially, I think there was a lot of that. And I've also wondered if there's also at the same time, like a slow, cautious step away from me for certain people, They're sort of like, I think she's a neocon. I think she tagged a neocon on Twitter. So she's got neocon adjacency.
It's hard to tell if they're actually just backing away from you or if they just forgot you exist. I mean,
that's the other thing. I haven't put out a book in 7 friggin' years.
Or just they're not thinking about you.
They're not thinking about you. It's
hard to say like, well, I didn't get invited to this, conference or festival. And it's like, well, no, they just like didn't think of you that year.
I know. I've never actually been very good at being able to gauge my so-called literary clout or cachet, like I would have no idea what that is. What I know is that people, a lot of people reached out to me. I think a lot of people know that I'm someone that they can come to with their own complications. I do worry as I get slotted into the whatever we call this, heterodox, problematic.
I think heterodox is not working because too many people don't know what it means and think it's a sexual orientation. That's what I'm finding.
That's really funny.
Yeah. Okay, but yes, once you're in this space, I call it the free think space.
Yeah, once you're in the free think space, I mean, I do worry that, I have friends in so many different areas of life. I have friends that are, that are conservative, and I have friends that have transitioned, and I have friends that have kids that have transitioned, and I have friends that have kids and they're freaked out that they might transition.
You're talking about gender transition, not political transition. Sorry, I thought we were back on the neocon because you and I have transitioned into neocon, evidently.
Oh gosh,
so, yes, you're talking about gender.
I meant, a friend that's trans. Yeah. Language. But yeah, I worry. But again, this is like I have to live my life and not. I can't spend my time worrying about what other people might think about me. It would lock me up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and as you and I have talked about, I just think there are so many people feeling exactly the way you felt and we have felt. I mean, so you were part of the original sort of brain trust of the Unspeakeasy, which is my heterodox, for lack of a better term, women's community that I'm building. And, I think people have heard me say this before. I think, part of the reason that in this kind of ecosystem of podcasters, the Fifth Column and Blocked and Reported, and a lot of the Substack journalists, there are a handful of women for sure, but it tends to be very male dominated,
super male dominated.
And I think that one of the reasons is that women are just more sensitive to the social penalties that come from speaking out. They don't want to be
onto something.
Yeah, they
Women
don't want to be
peacemakers and
right, and they don't want to be excommunicated by the other women, by their own peers.
Social exile is hell.
And the thing is too, so a lot of people, when we talk about getting canceled or whatever, it's happening to people in the workplace, men and women. But I think women are not only getting it on a professional level, but they're getting it socially. They're getting kicked out of their Facebook group or, some Facebook group or their book club, or things are really tense. So, as you know, this is part of the reason that I've started the Unspeakeasy, but, you have actually a very funny story. So I took 10 women out to the desert in Joshua Tree to do a 3 or 4 day brainstorming session over what this project could be. And there were a couple of us who were journalists, but mostly it was women who represented different sort of corners. There were, somebody, it was a lawyer, there was somebody who's a public policy person, someone in education, someone in the theater, and everyone sort of brought something to the table. But maybe you can tell the story. You have a very funny story about you rented
when
a
I was
car
driving up,
and you drove up, and
I was driving up. Yeah. Okay. So I was driving up, and I believe I was listening to Andrew Sullivan. And
you were driving from the airport from LAX. You were driving from LA
from the airport
to the
up
desert.
And so I was listening to Andrew Sullivan, and I have a long-standing habit of turning down my podcast so that nobody can hear what it is. And as I was driving in, it was like the quarters were a little bit tighter, and I turned down the volume.
So wait, you were on like a road, you were on like the desert road going into 29 Palms or something. Okay. Yeah.
And so then as I pull into the place where we're staying, it's a little bit loud, but I've got the windows up, and I'm sort of like, oh gosh, I hope nobody heard that, and I turn it down. And as I get out of the car, somebody else there goes, oh my God, were you just listening to Andrew Sullivan? I was just listening to that. And it was really cute.
It was an incredible time. I mean, we laughed really hard, and we learned a lot of stuff. And I'm really excited about this. But going back to the reason I'm curious what kinds of responses you're getting to your sort of coming out here is that, people have gone onto the mailing list, and I have hundreds and hundreds of women who've signed up, for the mailing list for the Unspeakeasy, and I have them sort of answer a few questions about what issues they're most interested in, and, in what way, why they would want to be part of this community. And the answers are just so moving and like heartbreaking, and like, I feel like I'm crazy. I feel like I'm the only one. I feel like I'm a bad person, and I am a liberal. I have never voted for a Republican. And by the way, this is not a partisan group. Republicans, I hope that there are Republicans and Democrats and everybody in between. This is not a political group, but it's just like one after the other, and they are piling up and piling up. And these are women from everywhere in the world, Australia, Europe, Canada, as well as North America, everywhere. And they represent I'm hearing from women in finance and women in medicine and in the arts. It's not just like the people in the media and podcasters banging on about this stuff. And so that's why I think it's like this, it's an incredible thing that's happened with the discourse, where like it really is an emperor's new clothes kind of thing, because people are being silenced because they believe that what they think is an outlying position, when in fact it's absolutely the majority position.
It's not. And there's so much silent estrangement. And that is the kind of stuff that art and thinkers and writers should be aiming toward, is to bridge that gap. And I think, like, I loved being at that weekend retreat. One of the things that was just such a delight was knowing that, like, it was almost like deprogramming camp or something. Like you didn't have to be like, I'm sorry that I listened to this one thing that you guys might not approve of. It was like, or like, I know you're going to think I'm sexist, but like a lot of things.
We didn't have any throat clearing.
We didn't have a lot of that throat clearing. You could just be human, and people would take you as a fully human person that might have different views from them, but was meaning well. I mean, one of the things that I saw happen over the last few years was the flattening of people into these categories: racist, sexist, predator, misogynist. And it's like, then I can just dismiss you with a finger flick. When you reduce somebody to a word, that is the opposite of what I want to be doing with my work and what I want to be doing with my life, which is to get into the human story and the human complications underneath and find the common areas where our fingers link together. I mean, that's what I felt so much of in this weekend. And also that everybody was just so excited to be together. There was, I think, I don't know, you'd have to quiz the other women. I've always had trouble with women's spaces.
Me too. But it's hilarious that I'm doing this because I've always been the, like, I'm not into like the women's-y sort of
in
group.
A way, because I have an allergy to like woo-woo stuff, and also have an allergy to like self-help things, which always seems to be like the category that if you're doing a woman's thing, it always ends up
there was
in.
no self-care involved in this.
No,
by the way.
It's always like turn to the person on your right and tell them something nice about them. And it's
we
just
didn't
like,
even
get
have
me
yoga.
The fuck out of here.
Yeah, I know. We didn't even have yoga, although there were some requests for yoga, so I might work that into
listen,
future retreats.
I dig yoga. I just I never like anybody telling me what to do. And I don't like forced cheer. And so this was something that was authentic cheer and joy. And it was really great. And yes, each of us had these individual stories of this sort of like disillusioning or fall from grace or fall from our community it was so sad. Not because, like, whether you want to call this cancel culture, I don't care what you call this. What this is a lot of silent human suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really profound. Everybody did have a story, some of them dramatic and some of them just really, really subtle. But it was really moving. And people did not agree, by the way. We have had all kinds of differing views on things. So
I don't want to agree with everyone.
No.
I don't. That's like the friction is the deliciousness of, like, that's what I'm in this for, is like I get to learn from you and you get to learn from me. And I just miss that dialectic, which I felt like was so much a part of my liberal upbringing.
Yes. And that was what college was, by the way.
That's what college was.
And after college, and just hanging out with people.
For me,
yeah,
I was sitting around at the bar and arguing and shooting the shit. And like, that was the great stuff of life to me, And so to enter a world where things get shut down so fast and there isn't so much of a prizing of intellectual, like, inquiry, curiosity about the other side, maybe learning from the other side, God forbid, loving and liking the other side. And these are sins of which I'm guilty of. But I've realized that if I'm going to be guilty of something, I'll take it.
Well, so before we end this, Sarah, tell us about what you're doing, including your podcast with Nancy Rommelmann.
I have a podcast too. I followed in your footsteps again.
Yeah, because there aren't enough, so we have to do our part.
No, I felt like we needed one more star in the galaxy. I'd been wanting to do a podcast for a while, actually, because of that joy I find in dialectic and in talk. I mean, listen, I'm just such a talker. I love talking. And I met Nancy when I did the Atlantic piece. Nancy Rommelmann is a wonderful writer. She's done many different pieces, but especially her reporting about Portland during the last few years has been particularly fascinating. And, she ran into it with people there because she was trying to tell a different story than they wanted told about.
She had a horrible situation. Yeah. Incredible.
So anyway, Nancy and I met that way. We kept doing conversations and we decided that we just really wanted to keep going with this. And I've been so thrilled to do it. It's called Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em. We talk about what's burning through the culture right now. And it's twice a week. We are... for me, it's been an incredibly grounding, wonderful experience. And we're starting to develop this community of people that, much like, the people that listen to your podcast tell you, wow, I thought I was the only one. I'm so glad to have this. This is really giving me hope. And you know what? If you're going to work in this side hustle world where everything has to be monetized and everybody's the pay scales are crap, and just do what you love.
Oh,
man.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Can you imagine doing drudgery? Oh, and as a in the new creative economy, I'm going to start a Patreon for something that I hate.
That would be awful.
I mean, yeah, that's, oh my God. If you're going to do something you hate, just please have good health insurance that somebody else is providing. Let's just put it that way. Well, so do you have, you're on Substack, the podcast is on Substack. Do you have, when you say community, are you talking about comments? Are you doing events? What kinds of things are you doing for the community?
Yeah, we're, right now it's just sort of people that comment and email us personally, but we are developing things that we want to do. I think Nancy had talked about at one point doing a book club. I don't know if she will. I might do a movie club. I have no idea. We're sort of experimenting with this. I think that we'll probably put out merch at some point.
All right.
Yeah.
That's great. You've made it when you're actually personally chasing down someone's delayed merch order. As the host of the show, it's a great look when I receive just irate email from somebody because their Nuanced AF t-shirt has not materialized in the mail. And so I actually have to track it down with the fulfillment center personally.
Oh, see, that's when I'll know I really made it as a podcaster. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. It's all artists get into the merch business eventually. It's where we all end up.
It's where we all end up. So, so we're experimenting. I hope we can do live events and we'll have guests on eventually. And I hope that you'd come on our podcast because I know I'd love to have you.
Of course, anytime. And so do you drop on a particular day or what's your schedule?
So far, it's been 2 days a week, but it's been a little bit uncertain, like vaguely Tuesday and Saturday. But because our schedules vary a little bit, we've had to cheat that a little.
Yeah. I'm wondering if that makes a difference. When I started the podcast, the advice I got was to be very consistent, that listeners, they want to know exactly when the show is going to drop.
Oh, I think that's
true. At the same time every week. But maybe that's starting to change.
Well, I think people do want consistency, but I think I wouldn't sacrifice doing something for it. In other words, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good kind of thing.
Oh, you mean if you get a better offer, a social, if you get invited to a party? What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, no, I just mean we can't, with Nancy and I, if we wanted to keep it on the same day every week, then we'd probably have to go down to once a week, and we'd rather do 2 and make it a little bit elastic but I don't know.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. Well, I have no social life, so it doesn't matter. Now that I have 2 podcasts, I definitely don't have the podcast is my social life. That's why I have guests. See?
Well, it's I'll tell you what. Some of the best conversations I ever have are on podcasts, and it's one of the reasons why I love listening to them. And when I started doing my podcast with Nancy, a lot of my friends told me hey, this reminds me of when you and I would talk on the phone. And I feel like I was sort of preparing for doing a podcast by having these long private conversations with people about social complications. But look, I'm a child of the 80s. I love the telephone. I love audio.
Oh, me too. Is that because we're from the 80s?
Well, I don't know if it's because we're from the 80s, but I can tell you that I came of age with someone's voice in my ear, on the telephone. And then because of loving radio, which I did, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a DJ.
Oh, I loved radio so much. I listened constantly. AM, FM. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just have a deep and abiding love for audio. And I think it's one of the, I don't know, to me, it's one of the most intimate mediums.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I don't do video, actually. I don't even like to record with the video on because I think it's distracting.
It's distracting to me when I'm talking. It's distracting sometimes when people are watching you. Why is she doing that? What's going on? So anyway, like the direct hit of the voice in the ear, and we can explore our heterodoxuality.
Oh, it's nice. I think there should be a dating app just for
heterodoxuality.
Heterodox date. Yeah. All right. We're gonna work on that. Anyway, well, Sarah, thank you as always for coming on the podcast. I love talking with you, and congratulations on the podcast with Nancy. Smoke 'em if you got 'em, and everything
Meghan,
else.
you're a gift, and thank you so much for letting me on your show.
We'll do it again soon.
Okay.
That was my conversation with Sarah Hepola. She is the author of the memoir Blackout, the host of the Texas Monthly produced documentary podcast America's Girls about the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, and the co-host with Nancy Rommelmann of the podcast Smoke 'em If You Got 'em. She lives in Dallas, Texas. This is the Unspeakable podcast. Again, this podcast will be on hiatus for the rest of the summer. If that makes you fret, for some reason, you can catch my new podcast with Sarah Hepola, A Special Place in Hell, which is on Substack and all the usual places. I would add that this little break from The Unspeakable would be a great time to catch up on any episode you might have missed. The show is coming up on its 2-year anniversary, and there have been more than 90 episodes. So even if you think you've listened to every single one, I bet you missed at least a few. You'd be surprised how many times someone writes in and recommends a guest, and it turns out that the guest has already been on the show. So great minds. You can go to the website at theunspeakablepodcast.com, and there are pages and nice photos and descriptions of every single guest ever. Not to mention, that's where you find the Nuance store, where you can purchase all that amazing official Unspeakable Podcast Nuanced AF merchandise. Finally, again, the Unspeakeasy, my intellectual community for free-thinking women, is being built, and you can learn about it at theunspeakeasy.com. I'm planning to get that launched around Labor Day, which is also when this podcast will be back. Until then, have a safe and nuanced summer, although I suspect summer is the least nuanced season of the year. I'll be back in September. See you then.